All right, as the last folks enter from the waiting room, I'm just going to go on and get us started. Again, I'm Marla Miller and I direct the public history program at UMass Amherst and am delighted to be moderating the second panel. I want to begin by welcoming everyone back and thanking the panelists in the first session for a fantastic conversation, and also for closing on this note about the importance of new research and local research to our larger understanding of these topics. So obviously that was the perfect note to end on, because in this session, we're going to be hearing from folks who've done that research. And we're obviously interested in inviting all of you into this larger project. And so the presenters who are going to share their insight with us today have all had a hand in that work one way or another and have expertise to share with us. So they're each going to make 15-minute presentations. We'll have about a half an hour for questions. So I invite you all to just put your questions in the public chat to everyone. I'll keep an eye on that as we go along and then funnel them to our presenters when we come around to the discussion section. Folks are going to present in the order that they appear on the website. So first, we're going to be hearing from Emma Winter-Zeig, Education and Interpretive Programs Manager at Historic Northampton. Then we'll turn to Joe Carvalho, who's retired from his role as President and Executive Director of Springfield Museums. Joe is also the author of the book, Black Families of Hampden County, Massachusetts, 1650 to 1865. Next, we'll hear from Marjorie O'Toole, who is the Executive Director at Little Compton Historical Society in Rhode Island, who've undertaken a project that in many ways models what we're going to be up to this summer. And lastly, we'll hear from Erica Slocum, who's a graduate student at UMass in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies and the curator of the recent exhibition, Black Holyoke. So welcome to all our presenters. And with that, I'm going to turn things right over to Emma.
Hi, well, it's great to be here today. Like Marla said, my name is Emma Winter-Zeig. I'm the Education and Interpretive Programs Manager at Historic Northampton. So to start with some background about my project. Oh wait, I should share presentation. One moment. Well, it appears it's not going to let me share a screen. So hopefully I can email my presentation and we can get that circulated to people, because I do have some resources in there. I'm the Education and Interpretive Programs Manager at Historic Northampton, and we started our project, the Slavery Research Project in Northampton 2 years ago, or about 20 in pandemic time, when we opened an exhibit called Making It on Main Street. If you're a local museum, you know that there are a few questions you get all the time. Ours were, we got a lot about the history of slavery in Northampton and a lot about different topics in the 18th century. So we knew that in making this exhibit, we would have to cover both of those subjects. But as we got more into the planning, we realized sort of how much we didn't know, and that also how much the knowledge that was out there that was great was really stratified. So there'd be a paper there or like a paragraph in a book here. And so we ended up putting together a feature panel based on what we knew at the time, and then we began to research in earnest. We've been doing this project since then, and we're in our final phase. We've collected dozens of names and have been able to compile some of that stratified knowledge. It has been an incredibly rewarding research project. But today, I don't really want to talk to you about the results of that project. I want to share with you some of what I learned about how to do these projects. Specifically, I want to talk about doing large-scale research with a team. Some of this might seem basic to some of you, but I'm trying to give a sense of how to start one of these projects from the ground up. It could seem insurmountable, but as hard as it is attainable even at a small museum. So how do you start your project? First, let's talk about what to look for. One of the first things we did when we started our project was just talk to scholars of the history of race in the Valley about what kinds of terms to look for. Then I started to make my list. I would give this list to everyone who got involved in the project, so they would feel less like they were looking for a needle in a haystack. And many of the terms that we looked for fell into a few categories. Terms that directly reference someone's enslaved status, like slave or enslaved, a euphemistic term for someone's enslaved status, like servant. This is particularly common in New England. Terms that refer to escape or another route of taking one's freedom. Terms that refer to race. And there's a note here. There is a range in here in terms of the loaded history of these terms. I made it my policy not to say some at all. It is impossible to ignore them as an avenue of research, but I would recommend considering the social dynamics when you are talking about that research. Then there's some terms that you want to search for, but kind of the search is not the end. So when I mentioned servant, you will also get, you'll get people who are enslaved. You will also get people who are indentured servants and people who are domestic workers. And then another big category of that is appearance. So a lot of people will be referred to by their complexion, but complexion and race are not the same thing. So you may see people that say they have a dark complexion, but that is actually not telling you what their race is. So for both of those, I would say do not ignore that information. You should record all of it, but you want to make sure that you're going back and trying to find anything else that you can about those people to tell you whether they're a useful subject for your project. So the next topic to cover is secondary sources. Your team does not need to have the kind of expertise that you have. And in fact, you'll be limiting yourself if you are just trying to find seasoned scholars to work on this. So you'll probably be dealing with a range of comfort levels in the period you're studying. So everyone who signs up for your project should get a list of secondary sources. A strategy I like to use was to pick like a few required ones and then load up our Google Drive with a lot of different ones on a wider subject area so that people could dip into it at will. I also encourage all of our project participants to come to me with questions. Much of the research for this project was done by a truly amazing team of interns from UMass, Amherst College, Smith, and Hampshire. And I've thought of it as part of my job that whenever they had a question from primary source that I would do secondary source research to support them. They asked fantastic questions, and I'm sure your participants will too. The key here is accessibility. Don't assume that your participants have an academic library or the resources to purchase books. If you have your local library or access to an institutional database, download readings or purchase them. If you want something from a hard copy book, scan it or photocopy it. Source categories. So the next step is you're going to want to find your archival sources. I started by plugging my list of search terms into the archival databases at all 5 colleges, and I would recommend you doing that in your area too. Look at the holdings of your local libraries and colleges as well as your own. Think about every type of resource they might have, like archival papers, microfilm newspapers and documents, and access to online databases. So in terms of what categories of source you're looking for, I just wanted to give you a few examples so you see kind of how wide the range is. One big one is church records. Church records are a fantastic source. See what local churches were around during the period you are studying and start calling them, start calling around to see where their records ended up. Vital records. There are a few different ways to find these. Check out genealogical websites like Ancestry and Family Search, check genealogical associations, and if you're in Western Massachusetts, definitely check archive.org because they have a ton of them for this area, and they are searchable. And also, of course, check your library. They're great sources and worth the effort to find them. Probate records are sort of a high risk, high reward situation because you can read a lot of probate records and find absolutely nothing. But if you find something, there's a good chance that you will get a lot of information in one place, particularly if you're dealing with a manumission. For this, if you can't find them easily online, you can also try asking your local government and try searching by your county, not just your city, because that's how a lot of these records get grouped. Census and tax records are kind of a similar deal in that they're definitely worth tracking down. And if you can't find them in any of your other searches, you should try and ask government sources. Historical secondary sources are also a interesting if problematic source. You should definitely look through local histories. that were written in the past few hundred years or during your time period. But take everything that you find with a grain or a pound of salt. And they're a good source for names or local lore, though. Another kind of obvious source is newspapers, but they can be a problem in more rural areas that might not have had a local newspaper. When we did our project, Northampton's main newspaper was not established until I think the last 5 years of the time period we were looking at. But you should try and track down copies either on a database or a microfilm in a library. But news spreads far, so don't limit yourself by your own geographical area. Do general searches in newspaper databases for your list of terms and include the name of the area you're researching. In terms of court records, I would say make them a lower priority because in my experience, there have been fewer obvious references to enslaved or free status. If you have ledgers in your collection or in other local collections, I would say also definitely check them because some people include labor as one of the products. And so you might get names that way. In terms of genealogy sites, I found these to be more useful to find digitized sources than to find actual records. So I would say maybe like think about how much time you want to devote to this, but that is also because they're a little better sort of for more modern periods. So if you're in the 18th or 19th century, the 19th or 20th century, definitely go for it. I would say the last thing is family papers. These you'll usually find in a library or another cultural institution, and they should probably be the last thing you search unless you already know all the names you're looking for. So I had in my presentation some sources in the Valley, but hopefully I can put those in the chat later. Since I can't get it up too. So in terms of how to, so in terms of who can do this project, anyone can do it. So you should cast a wide net and you should look for people who, I would say the most important thing is that they have some primary source training, but if they don't have it, then I would say just spend some time at the beginning talking about how you read primary sources and just have more of a training than you might. And in general, I've found that it's more important to have people who have experience in the primary source category than in the sorry, I'm getting a message, then in the subject area. So in terms of how to organize the work, I would say make sure you're giving people their own sources so they have ownership of over their product. This could be doing one volume of a set or having someone who becomes an expert in newspaper research. But you also should make sure to give them a side project in case it gets too much for them to be just reading one thing for a really long time. Make sure you have regular check-ins, either virtual or in person, and schedule both group and individual time. And I would say you should start your project by trying to acquire names of research subjects and then drill down on those names as you get them. So in terms of what problems you might run into, digitization, we're all familiar with this one. I would say just be prepared to have this issue, that you might have to start emailing around to people to ask if they've seen a document, etc. There are going to also be a lot of gray areas in this type of research. I mentioned about indentured servants. You might not always know the race of the person you're researching or whether they are enslaved or free. I would say err on the side of keeping too many notes, but be very clear about exactly what you know about each person. A big one is also reading the handwriting. You could have people in your group who have never read a handwritten primary source or did not learn cursive in school. Luckily, the internet is here to help. At the beginning, I made a list of sites that are specifically designed to help people to learn to read historic handwriting and sent it out to participants. There are a million of these. Choose your favorites and distribute widely. I like the National Gallery in the UK. It has a fun game. There's also a really good one at Reed. But don't just send out the resources. Make sure that you're giving your participants like a handwriting pep talk unless they're seasoned pros. Because if some people are having a hard time reading, they might feel like ashamed of it and not tell you. So make sure they know it's completely normal and that they should go as slow as possible as they need to at the beginning until they feel comfortable. It's sort of like if you're like walking in the dark and your eyes have to get adjusted to it, and then you'll be able to move around more easily. Another larger problem is fatigue and discouragement. So reading lots of documents for a really long time is hard, and you should be upfront with project participants about this. So here's a couple things that I've found help. You need to get to sort of be keeping track of how your participants are working and how long they are working. Tell them how many hours you expect of them and take into their schedules into account, and make it clear that you do not expect more or think that more is a good idea. If it seems like they're working a lot at home, working all night, then you should strongly encourage them to take breaks and take time for themselves. If someone is having trouble, you should talk to them about how, like physically, how they are reading. Like, are they close reading everything when they should be skimming? Are they reading over and over language that's like on a form and doesn't change? And you should also encourage time together, virtually, if not in person. These projects work better when you develop community. You don't have to spend all of your time together, but try to have semi-frequent group meetings or preferably group work time. So, and you should also, like I said, make sure that everyone has like a side project so that if they get really frustrated, they can sort of have another avenue to go down. Another major problem, of course, is the difficulty with the subject matter. These sources can be really tough to read, and this is a project where many times if you find the result that you are looking for, you will be finding languages that dehumanizes people of color. As a project leader, the emotional well-being of your participants is your top priority. The first step, I think, is to be transparent. I talked about trigger warnings right at the beginning and throughout. And if it seemed like a participant was dealing with a source that had a lot of dehumanizing or violent language, I would make sure to check in with them individually and let them know that I was there to listen. Another key is to give participants space to talk in general. If you create an environment where you're an active listener, they will be more likely to tell you if they're having an issue with the content. Lastly, I think that also that building community aspect really helps with this, that if you are able to talk to each other and, you know, pull out some of the lighter moments in your sources, and then that really helps people from getting dragged down by some of the material. So some of the issues are more specific to research in terms of people of color. The historic erasure of people of color will present issues for your research. One big way this will show up is that the people themselves will often not be named. Many records will show them with no last name or with a nickname or just as their race with no name at all. So this can be discouraging, but you should write down each and every one of these and then try and look into connections. And sometimes being referred to that way actually shows you that you are dealing with a person of color. The big drawback to the strategy, though, is that the kind of links that you need to bind resources with the same name are really hard to find. The suppression and disregard for Black lives and history societally and in most institutions means that you might only find one reference to a person in one source. So how do you deal with that? Well, I would say, like, sometimes you can't deal with it. Sometimes that's all you're going to get, but also don't give up. Try as many search engines as you can think of and get creative with the terms. I have gotten some of my best finds on like try 50 in Google Books. And also contact each other. If you have a name or location, reach out to libraries or other historical societies. They might have a connection that you don't see yet. So in terms of what's next, if I could sum up my advice in one sentence, I would be to start out your project with a very specific goal of what you are doing and why. It might also be helpful if the why comes first and you let that inform the what. Our project focused on slavery in the 18th century because that's a period of time and subject matter that was vital to our interpretation of local history. But I also think that there's more than one reason to start a project like this. You need to know about the version of a research project that works best for you based on your constituencies and your institution's research focus. If you're starting it for your audience, make sure you're asking your audience what they want. We started this project for our own institutional goals, and as it went on, and I talked to constituents who are people of color about it, our next steps began to take shape. My takeaway from those conversations was while no one was unhappy that we were doing a project researching slavery, many people did not feel that it was answering the questions about their past that they wanted answered. What I heard most often was inquiries about how the late 19th and 20th centuries had changed racial dynamics in Northampton. I'm wrapping up this project, but this is the area where I hope to go next. I'm excited to think about how to tackle this new chapter, but more than anything, I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to work on this research, and I'm grateful for all the time that all the interns, staff, volunteers, boards, scholars, and local historians have put into doing this work. Every tip that I talked about today is something I learned from working with them. And I know if you choose to embark on a project under your own, that I hope I've given you a start to that learning process. Thank you very much.
Wow, Emma, thank you. That was very thoughtful and thorough and inspiring. I love that you encourage people not to give up when it seems like you're not finding what you want to find. That's great. So we will pass the baton now to Joe Carvalho. Oh, gotta unmute.
There you go. All right. Emma, that was excellent. Just excellent. It's just great to see a younger generation really knowing what they're doing and encouraging people. When I started my quest after I got out of the master's program at William & Mary, came to Springfield, worked at the Springfield Library and Museums in charge of the local art history department. And I was all excited about trying to help people with their family history, connecting local history to them personally. And I found it very frustrating to help African-American patrons locate records. So I took it on a mission to try to find as many of these records for them so they could at least have a resource to connect their contemporary lives with their ancestors. And it took me on a 40-year trip of finding records. But one of the things that I did find, and Emma pointed it out, is that local histories very seldom mention African Americans' contributions. If they are, they're sort of incidental or anecdotal about some awful event or whatever. Not very, very flattering and not very detailed. So started the whole process like most genealogical research, going through vital records and all the traditional, of course, going to the various towns. Back then, there was no digital records for me to look at. So I'd visit towns, and almost every town clerk in the suburban area would say, well, we don't have Black people in our town, so we wouldn't have. So let me look through the records, please. And finding evidences of African-American presence going back to the 17th century, of course. So a lot of those records now are digitized and you can find them a little easier, but there was a whole range of exotic sort of records that people don't often use that could be very, very helpful and, or provide some really startling little stories that you could suss out to tell more about the lives of individuals. And I think getting into the stories of an individual family or an individual can really speak to the larger issue of slavery and the experience. And so, for example, one of the things we have to remember that slavery, when it ended, that these Black Americans were left reasonably poverty-stricken going into their life of liberty, which also left them with very few choices. A lot of times they ended up working for the same people who had enslaved them as day laborers on their property. In fact, if you look at the 1790 census, you'll see other free persons and that's usually the black laborers who were at that former slave owner's farm, still working. But that would also give you a hint of whose probate records to look at. Say, wait a minute, let me look at this probate record so I could find some of the names of these individuals. Also, get an idea of what church records to look at, because through all this period, there's still ministers often still would minister to the slaves. And in their records, they might even have in their diaries, Ballantyne out of Westfield, for example, very detailed records of going to slave owners to minister to their slaves, including presiding over a funeral, a burial, or certainly baptisms and births. Not as many marriages because that wasn't really allowed unless there were free people. Because that'd be a question of who owns the children. Again, this whole issue of slavery and who really controlled the children, not the parents, the slave parents, but the owners would then, I hate to say dispose, but in other words, farm out the children to other people and possibly sell them. And so you have the problem of reconstructing those families. You have to kind of go through all these records. One of the things that you'd find is through probate. Sometimes you'll find some of those connections of people giving the daughter of Tamar, to their cousin or whatever, and then later on when she's freed in the 1790s at age 45 and trying to have a family. Then you say, gee, there's a connection through the name. Of course, they wouldn't have last names when they were slaves, but afterwards they often acquire them or pick one out for themselves. And that's always a trying to connect the slave name to someone with a surname. Again, is a challenge, and you have to use these records. One of the records that I found very interesting were the court records about warnings out. Usually there were legal arguments between towns saying who's responsible for these individuals. And so in the court cases, again, so very specifically about who the children are the children of so-and-so and so-and-so. They're really from Springfield, and why does Worcester have to take care of them, etc. And so in this negative experience in the court, you actually get a lot of positive information about the family. So that's important. Pauper records in towns are another source to find these. Again, it's amazing. The tragedy of a lot of this is when freedom happened, you're freeing someone who had been a slave and they're 65, 70 years old. And now they're at the end of their work and their ability. They might be infirm, etc. And now they're set loose. Okay, you're free. Thank you. Well, now the pauper, they became town charges, etc. And there's records that can identify that. The other thing is we often forget how many African Americans served in the Revolution, and especially toward the end of the war, when there was a northern fatigue of the war, that people did not want to serve, and especially you got to remember the war went till 83, and Yorktown's 81. There's still people in the regiment, so the Black folks were being brought into the regiments more and more. In fact, as even in 1777, when von Riedesel came through as a captive through Westfield, they were remarking how many African American soldiers they saw. So you look at the Revolutionary War records in it, and as Emma pointed out, they'll tell complexion, etc. It doesn't automatically, if you say someone is how they're described, swarthy or dark or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean they're African American, but you follow the trail. You also the records that become important is the pension records, those who survived to get a pension. And oftentimes, because again, when they were freed, they were often given here's your endowment to continue your life. They became town charges, etc. And some of these towns actually went to the government to say, hey, I want to get this pension record so I can pay for this guy. And so there's interesting connection of that. I also found a number of times when white New Englanders actually engaged a slave, a former slave, to serve for them under their name. And then in the court records afterwards, in the pension records, they'll say someone like one of the son of, I can't remember the white person's name, but the person was Zebulon Wallace. They said, oh yes, he served under my father's name, so the guy could get a pension. So if you have to look at these exotic records sometimes to find this. I find that the church records, of course, town records and vital records are good, but church records are really good because, again, they have, when people join, and they were a little more detailed about African Americans sometimes than the vital records. So that's another place to look. And then you got to piece it all together. I find that it's very important to, as a parallel, is to be aware of the white families who owned slaves and to look at their records, their diaries, etc., because they're going to give you some connections with this, and especially if families have been split apart. Now, some of them were done like the Ashley family in Western Mass. There were a number of Ashleys who had slaves, and they were contemporaneous. They were cousins and brothers and sisters and fathers and uncles. And sometimes they would lend out their slaves, and then they ended up having this, staying with the other person. So you can link those African American families together that way. Also, they were had less of a problem with liaisons between male and female slaves because they weren't as worried about who ended up with the children. It's all this sort of, slaves as property. You have to keep that in mind as much as it's distasteful to think about. That's an important ingredient as you look at these records to find out how do you connect these families back together. So that's some things I wanted to offer up in my book on African Americans from 1650 to 1865. It's also available digitally on Academia EDU. And then you look up I've got about, I don't know how many articles and books in there, and they're all digitally searchable, including my John Brown articles, etc. So, that could be useful for people to take a look at. It also has all the bibliography of where these sources came from. So that could be useful. Also, I'm the co-editor of the Heritage Books division of the Springfield Republican newspaper in Mass Live. And one of the books I co-wrote with Wayne Faniff was called Struggle for Freedom. And that talks about African-American presence in Western Mass, Springfield and Western Mass from the 17th century up to today. So that might be a useful resource for some of your folks that are working on the project to look at. So there's sort of the range of things and there's so many different kind of records to look at, but it's important to look for those examples. Oh yes, another thing is during the colonial period, look the colonial records that are at the Mass Archives. The court records are important too. Don't forget those, because sometimes the local records, for example, in Westfield, there were a number of records that had been redacted because of the sort of embarrassing situation. For example, there was one fellow's wife had a liaison with her slave and had a child for that. The local records were all redacted. You couldn't find it, but the state record, the court record, had the details of who it was and what happened. So again, sometimes there's a parallel. Oh, last thing is the newspapers, as Emma pointed out, are important, but it's amazing. You can find records of slaves in not just escaped slaves from the southern states, but from Massachusetts and Connecticut in the early Massachusetts newspapers, because sometimes slaves, people who've been enslaved, dying at 80 years, 100 years old or 90 years old later on, become a story in some cases. And you can find some interesting little tidbits about people who were slaves, but are now free and are sort of like, an interesting sidelight that the newspaper pointed out in a small little, maybe 1 or 2 line, obituary. They didn't really have extended obituaries in the early 19th century, but sometimes they had a story because there's something behind it. For example, there was one African American, Native American person who served in the French Indian War, and when they died, they had a pretty large column in the local paper that people all came out to recognize this guy was famous and so forth. So you can find those things, but they're not contemporary with the era of slavery in Massachusetts, but they reflect on those years. So it's just something to look at.
That's great. Thank you, Joe. Again, super substantive. You're reminding me of a tip I learned from Laurel Ulrich, who may be familiar to many people in the audience years ago, about how you know when you've done all the work. And she used this phrase, getting all the butter from the duck. And the D in duck was document linkage. And you're talking about, telling a story by following it through all the possible places. I'll put in the chat a little bit more about how she advised that, and maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A. So with that, I'm delighted to hand the baton now to Marjorie O'Toole.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me with you. Let me get started by sharing my slides. And we'll go back one. So I am the executive director of the Little Compton Historical Society in Little Compton, Rhode Island. We are a small but mighty historical society. I am the only full-time staff member, and typically we just have seasonal workers, tour guides. We do something different every year. That's how we encourage people to come back and see us every year. And so in 2016, we focused on Black history. Shorthand, we call it our Slavery and Freedom Project. So that project is now 5 years old. So I hope what I can share with you is a little bit of, hindsight is 2020. These are some of the things we learned from our project, and maybe if you hear them at the beginning of your work, maybe that will be helpful to you in some way. Our project involved a special exhibition. You just saw some of the exhibit panels that we did for the exhibition in the previous slide. We published a 325-page book that represents about 5 years of research into the subject. We created an online database, which you can see if you go to our website, littlecompton.org, underneath our historical resources. And keeping each little tidbit of information in a searchable database was key to keeping track of things. This sounds like you're going to have lots of different people who are all going to find different records, some of those records on the same people. I can imagine how a central database is going to be incredibly valuable to you to make connections and to find multiple records for different people. We took a room in our historic house museum and reinterpreted it to be the sleeping quarters of the indentured servant that we learned lived in the Wilbur House Museum, lived and worked. We had a lecture series, we had free school visits. The panels for the Jane exhibit turned into a traveling exhibit. It is very rare that a Little Compton Historical Society project is of interest to the rest of the world, but because the topic was Black history and with a focus on slavery, it was of great interest, and the traveling exhibit actually lived for a couple of years in Providence in a couple of different venues. And now we use it as a traveling exhibit. There were lots of speaking engagements. We have had the privilege of working with other Rhode Island communities interested in doing the same sort of work, and have been able to coach them through part of it. And I think the most important thing is that this project is ongoing. So often with our special exhibitions, we present it and then it's over and we move on to something new. But this project continues to resonate because the information we learned about our Black residents and our Native American residents has now created a permanent change in what we do. So every project we do from now on includes the stories of people of color, and becomes all the richer for doing that. This is a picture of our newly interpreted indentured servants quarters. So some things that I took away from the project, and I'm going to have different slides on each of these, so we won't go through the list right now. But you know, these are the things that I'll be talking about for the next few minutes. We found that it was important to think beyond our site. You know, if we had just focused on, you know, the history of slavery or the history of people of color at the Wilbur House, it would be a very uninteresting story. So we decided to do the whole town, and that's part of our mission. It's part of our mission to the history of the whole town, so that's very appropriate. And we were able to find records documenting the lives of 200 enslaved people from 1674 to 1816. In addition, 50 people who were either forcibly or voluntarily indentured, and dozens of free people of color. That made for a very rich, nuanced, complicated history of the people of color in Little Compton, which it's important for you to know today is almost exclusively a white community. The 2010 census showed that we had less than 1% people of African or Native American descent. So we look like a fully white community, and it was really quite surprising for people to learn that in 1755, 10% of our population were people of color, and that we do have such a rich Black history here in this community. Forgotten, completely forgotten, and we hope resurrected. We found that it was impossible to separate indigenous slavery from African slavery. And so it was really important to our project to be alert to both, to document both, and to report on both. Indigenous slavery predates African slavery. It started certainly with the Pequot War in 1630 and continued. Indigenous and African people lived in the same household, were enslaved in the same household, created families together, and it's really important to bring all of those folks into your research. This particular runaway notice shows two Negro slaves and a Spanish Indian running away together. It would just be wrong for us to ignore one or the other types of slavery. We have to report on them together. This project began as a 20-page research paper that I was working on when I was getting my MA in Brown's Public Humanities program. And it was supposed to be just a paper on African slavery in Little Compton. Became very clear to me very quickly that Black history does not begin and end with slavery. We really have an obligation to do more than that whenever we're able to do so. And so the project began to encompass slavery, indenture, newfound freedom, the abolitionists in our community, and incidents of racism in our community as a way to help explain why we do not have people of color living in Little Compton today. And I hope that you'll think about expanding your scope as well to include all these things. I think one of the best pieces of advice I can give you is to go public as early as possible with the work that you're doing. And that means putting interesting stories as you find them on social media. In my particular community, Facebook is exactly the right platform for my audience. When we found something interesting, we would share it on Facebook, and we would get benefits in a couple of ways. Not only are we building an audience for our future public facing programs, but we are also getting people related to the people we're talking about, from the slave owning families that we're talking about, interested in the subject in general, who start to share privately owned documents with us, things that are in their desk drawers or trunks up in their attic. And as they start to become engaged in our project and feel more and more comfortable with us and the work that they're doing, they start to physically bring these documents to us at the Historical Society for our use. That was pivotal to the work that we were doing. I would encourage you all to be confident as you go forward with this, sometimes very challenging work. It hasn't been done, and it hasn't been done because it's hard, but it can be done. If you think, well, there's no records out there, that's just wrong. For my tiny little town of Little Compton, I found thousands of records that referred to people of color. They are there. You just have to look harder for them than you would look for records of white people. I was afraid maybe my board of directors wasn't ready for this. They would push back against the suggestion that we do this work. Several of them descend from slave owning families. I have 4 board members who are in their 90s. Everyone on the board was fully behind this. It was accepted unanimously with no discussion to the contrary. So my board was ready. The community was ready. They responded positively from the beginning. They funded us at a level where we had never been funded before with their donations. They wanted to see this work come forward. I would say in our first year, our audience was about 4,000 or 5,000 people. That's a lot because in our town, we have a population of 3,600 people. Out of those 4,000 or 5,000 audience members, there were only 4 negative interactions. And that is statistically insignificant. And so we don't even give them the benefit of consideration. We just move on and we focus on the thousands of people who responded positively to this work. Because I was in graduate school when I was doing this, I had the benefit of the attention and the help of some really brilliant historians at Brown. Lynn Fisher read my manuscript, and Lynn was very supportive, but one of his comments that always stuck with me is, this is great, Marjorie, but it really is just a bunch of stories. So Lynn is a wonderful academic historian. He was missing the argument. He was wondering what my argument or my point was in doing all this work. I want to say, as a public historian, as a local historian, argument is overrated. You do not need an argument when you do this work. Simply sharing the stories, well-researched, well-documented, footnoted stories of historic people of color, that is absolutely enough. And that is what the public wants and needs in order to connect themselves and their families to the past. So don't worry about an argument. I think arguments actually hurt this sort of work because it might make us inclined to privilege some stories over others. Present your stories to the public. That's exactly what they need. Something is better than nothing. If you can't do an exhibit, you can't write a book, that's okay. Put your things on Facebook. That is wonderful. The public will benefit. It will grow in time. Even a little bit is better than nothing. And then, as a white person, the only person in my community doing research on historic people of color, I often thought, boy, I am really not the right person to be doing this. I don't have a PhD. At the time, I only had a bachelor's degree. I am white. I do not have colonial descendants. My people were all late 19th century immigrants, maybe I'm not the right person. But again, I was better than nothing. I turned out to be the right person because nobody else was interested in doing it at the time. And I could and I did bring others in. So I consulted with PhDs who are incredibly generous with their time and their experience. And I consulted in the same way with extremely generous and helpful people of color, of African descent, of indigenous descent, who commented on the book, who shared what they knew, and who made it a much better project because of their inclusion. Why do we do this work? I'm preaching to the choir here, right? You're all poised to do this. I don't have to convince you. It is the right thing to do, and it is the time to do it. Let me focus for a minute on on secondary sources. I inherited many histories of enslaved people, Native American people. These histories are very questionable, very broken. And if you compare them to the primary sources, they really fall apart. They do an injustice to the people that they talk about. There's a list here on the screen of the ones that really jumped out at me at needing repair. Just to begin with, in our archive, when I started work here 14 years ago, there's a list of 44 Negroes and Indians. When I began my paper for graduate school, I thought, well, hey, great, this is where I'm going to go because there were 44 Negroes and Indians in Little Compton. I'll write about them. When I began the research, it became clear it was, I must be getting close to time. I see messages blinking. There must be way more. And indeed, there were 250. At the bottom, you see Ann Peabody in Caesar Church. That is what a well-meaning town clerk wrote in his beautiful handwriting after he transcribed the old records in 1843. His records cannot be trusted. If you'll see, in the earlier colonial records in terribly difficult handwriting, it actually says Anne and Caesar Negro servants. Our town clerk stripped these people of their race. They stripped these people of their freedom status, truly whitewashing the records so that they don't appear to be people of color any longer. You cannot trust 19th century records. You have to go back to the colonial records for the real information that you're searching for. Celebrate what you're doing. Today's Juneteenth. We're all celebrating. Our panels, our exhibit panels are right now sitting in our Quaker Meeting House, open to the public for people to come see this exhibit for a one-day exhibition. And if you feel like I can be of any help, please reach out. Not to push the book that we wrote, but I do think it would be a nice model for some of you just beginning. And if anyone's interested in the book, call me. Don't go to Amazon, call me and we'll sell it to you at cost. And thank you very much.
Wow, Marjorie, that's a very generous offer. And I know a lot of people will take you up on it. I also want to say I really appreciate your thoughtful comments about positionality, which I know a lot of us are thinking about as we enter this work. And also your comments about connecting the past to longer trajectories in contemporary communities, which is a perfect segue to our next speaker, Erica Slocum. So Erica, I'll hand things over to you.
Well, I'm going to share my screen. And if any of y'all have been to any of my presentations about my work, a lot of the slides are the same. Just act like it's new to you. So I did, the title of my project is Reliquary of Blackness. I did an oral history project with the folks in Holyoke, Black folks in Holyoke, through the Wisteria Hearst, or through Wisteria Hearst. I love this quote from Arturo Schoenberg, who was he started the Schoenberg Museum in Harlem for Black history. in all things, Black for the diaspora, throughout the diaspora. And so he said, the American Negro must, excuse me, pardon me, excuse me, he must remake his past in order to make his future. And so I think that in us, similar to what folks have talked about today in the conversation about, doing the work of uncovering and documenting Black stories, my belief is that we should always involve, first and foremost, the Black community, right? As everyone said today, going to the primary sources and even having the opportunity to talk to folks who are descendants of, whatever time period you're looking at. Luckily for me, I was able to have living history in that many of the folks that worked with me on the project are still living, right? And so they have documents, they have pictures, they have, family stories. And so my focus is really on how do we reframe the conversation about Black history and culture in the museum, and who gets to be the word that I'm looking for, who gets to be the gatekeepers of that history, who gets to be the ones that say, like, we are the holders of knowledge, right? And I think that should always be with the people. And so I think that many museums have started to do that work through repatriation, through targeted programming, which we've heard different individuals talk about today, and also understanding the surrounding community, right? And so if you're in a community and you're doing work, like Joe said, like, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Marjorie and Emily said today, you're going to these places, and for some, in some instances, you're going to have folks who say, we don't have Black people here. We don't have records of Black folks here. And really, really understanding like what the surrounding community looks like today compared to what the community has looked like in the past. And really making space for those local narratives. This isn't so much relevant to, doing this work, but also I think it's really important to realize, like, it's not important to doing the research, but I think it is really important when we talk about whose stories are where and what museums and what places and spaces are dedicated to this history. I think that these numbers are very telling, but also very important to just think about when you're stepping into this work. So I'll talk a little bit, like very briefly, about Wisteria Hearst. I have this on the screen, so I'm not gonna read it for you all because you can see it. But I think that the beauty of stepping into that space for me was that I would say that Wisteria Hearst is a very white place, and has been historically, and very much so because of what the place is, right? What the space is. It's a historic home. It's dedicated to preserving the history of Holyoke, but also realizing that part of that history is a very white history, right? And so in doing this work and talking to people from the community of Holyoke, one thing that I got from folks is that, like, the space did not seem like a place that was for them. And not necessarily, not always because of the way that they were received and going to the space, but just because of the grandeur, because of the history of the place, and also because there were instances where they had been outright discouraged from being in that space. This is from the census from a few years ago, so it's not accurate to 2021, but if you look at this, what the racial makeup of Holyoke today is a very small Black population. And I think that, historically it has been a very small population of Black folks, but it's really important when we're talking about, telling the stories of community, telling the stories of local community, as Marjorie pointed out, it's really important to look at, like who is in this space, and how do the stories of folks kind of like intersect, right? So for me, documenting Black Holyoke was a bit of an adventure, I'd say. It was definitely really informative for me to be with the people. We started the project, really, it was the archivist and Penny Martorell and the director of the museum, Kate Chrysler, who were presented with this opportunity in looking at their archives and saying that, you know, folks have come in and told stories about, you know, Black folks working in the home, but we don't really have a lot in looking at the archive of like Black people in Holyoke and the history of Black folks in Holyoke. So like, how do we broaden our archive, right? And before you can like broaden the archive and really say like who is here and who is missing, we have to do an archival dig. And that archival dig didn't just consist of looking at the archives in Wisteria-Hearst, but also at the public library and at the UMass Special Collections and their archives to see, you know, what history was kind of preserved already and documented. And from that archival dig, and this is like it was very difficult because again, like the history wasn't like there was a finding aid or anything of the sort where we could go to and be like, here are the Black folks, right? So for us, it was like opening yearbooks, opening Wisteria-Hearst is lucky enough to have some city records and city documents. It's looking at books that have been written to try to find, you know, who are the people who are living here, right? And I would say the yearbooks were for the initial part were like some of the funnest things to do because it was like, for lack of a better like analogy, but it was like, where's Waldo, right? Because you're literally looking at all of these pictures and it's just like white faces. There's a Black one, you know, and just tagging the pages. And for us, that was like, for us specifically, that was the start of like collecting names before we went to the public. It was like, how do we find the people? You know, looking at some of the old newspapers that existed at the Holyoke Library, as well as at Wisteria-Hearst, and just, you know, like I said, trying to identify who the people were based on those documents. And from there, once we got to a point where it was like, I wouldn't even say that we were up against a wall or that we couldn't find anything else. We had collected a lot. We had started the finding aid. And at that point, it was like, all right, so we need to let the public know that we're doing this thing, because I think some people had already had some information about what we were doing. But it was really like, now we have to bring it to the public and we have to ask for their help in doing this work. And so we had folks, we put a call out in the newspaper and we had folks come for a collection day. We set up a specific day for folks to come and bring their documents, bring pictures, tell stories. We got on that day probably about 10 people to come. And it was really good because a lot of the information that we got from our collection day weren't things that, some of them were things that we knew and other things weren't. And so it gave us the opportunity to really like build on our knowledge, but also make the necessary connections to people that we knew who were, you know, bigger than, you know, we had imagined, right? Because of the things that they had gone on to do, or the connections to family. This picture here on the left is Miss Westbrook, and her family is one of the oldest Black families in Holyoke. You know, on the right is Doug, and his family has been here since the 19 teens, right? And one of the things that I've realized is that these folks have been collecting their family histories. And for Doug, he had church records at his home. He had photo albums of different families, like marriage certificates. Like there were a lot of things that he, as his family's historian, and I call him the Black Holyoke historian, that he had been collecting over the years. And so once we got to that point of like, here are some of the people, I went and I worked on making connections with the community, like personally, right? And so going to the church, being invited to folks' homes, going to the schools, and just really talking to people in the community, not only to see like what they had, but also like how did they want me to approach, you know, our oral history project, right? Like, so who should I talk to? What information should I really focus on? Excuse me. What information should I really focus on gathering? And so here I am, or I'm not in the picture, but this is Miss Westbrook sitting on her porch, and we're just going through newspaper clippings. We're going through, you know, some of her father's documents that he had, some of the things that her mother had, and on the right is Doug. We're going through the photo albums that he had collected, and you know, the things that he had preserved, like I said earlier, documents from you know, marriage certificates. He had church records that really like documented you know, when people were born, not just when they joined the church, like when were they born, when were they christened. For some folks, it was like, all right, they were in Holyoke, but then they moved to, you know, New York, or they moved to Springfield. And so a lot of the stuff that he had was really helpful for me. Like, my research is still ongoing, but for the purposes of the oral history project, it was really good because we were able to not just take the stories of what folks were telling, but we were able to match that up with some of the documents that he had. And this, again, is like across families. So he had a lot of information, has a lot of information about Black folks in Holyoke. And so, as I was saying earlier about the ways that things connected, you know, we found things in the yearbooks that then connected to like national kind of history, that was like information that was like on a national level. And just from a story that someone told, like, I was able to do research for the World Football League and find like J.G. Jennings, who was a Holyoke High grad, who went on to play for the American Football League and the World Football League. And so it was just, for me, I think the most important part, like I said earlier, is really about involving the community as much as we can, right? And if you have a whole team, like I didn't have a huge team of people that helped. Here on the left is Anisha Darkwell Davis. She is born and raised in Holyoke. She was an intern at Wisteriahurst. And so together with her and some other volunteers at the museum, we were able to do this work. But I would say we were probably a team of like 5. And that's not, you know, everybody working on everything all the time, right? Because they're volunteers for the museum, so they're doing other projects. And so a lot of it was going to the community. You know, at the church, they had documents at the church. Like I said earlier, like giving us names. I'm lucky enough to, again, have the privilege of like living history. And so being able to talk to folks who have, you know, some folks who are in their 90s, right? And so like they've been in Holyoke for a really long time. And so they have history that goes back and back, you know, to a time where, you know, Holyoke was a sundown town, right? To a time where, you know, Holyoke was largely segregated. And a thing that I think a lot of folks was news to them, that this was a thing that happened here, like locally in Massachusetts, because we like to think of those kinds of things as like a Southern problem for whatever reason. So the beauty of this too, like I said, just talking to people, really getting, because the archive isn't there on a local level within institutions, like the majority of the things that I collected from folks was from individuals who came and gave us their family, papers, and had been preserving the history of Black Holyoke, throughout generations. And interestingly enough, when we started talking to folks, they were telling stories that they had never shared before. So like, for instance, this picture, this is a sympathy march with the Dr. King's, with the March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And this is happening on High Street in Holyoke, right? And it's just like information that I didn't particularly find anywhere. I learned this story from, again, talking to Miss Trudy Munson. And through that, I found that Springfield and Holyoke sent buses down to the march. And Miss Munson was actually at the march, heard the speech in person, and had never even told her kids that story because it was something that she, had forgotten about, right? And so I think that projects like this are really important because, the history doesn't exist in a way that is in one place and concise. And so I think that, again, like the struggles for me in this, or the challenges for me in this, were not having everything kind of like easily accessible, or having had any real history that talked about, Black folks in Holyoke. Ella DiCarlo wrote her master's thesis on Black folks in Holyoke, spanning 1770s to the 1970s. And even in that, like when I talked to folks about that paper, when I talked to folks about the paper, this is a white woman writing Black history. And I think that her entry point was really the people who she had connections with. And so I think that often that limits, the kind of history that is told. So the exhibit was up. I'm at my point, my 15-minute mark, so I apologize for that, but I do want to show you all these pictures and just go through. I think this had this was a local history. This was, in different ways, a national history. But really what happened was, like, the exhibit and the project were an opportunity for families to make connections that they had never made before, for people to see folks that they hadn't seen in years, but also to see themselves, like I said earlier, Wistariahurst wasn't a place that many folks felt was welcoming to them. And in this, Black folks in the community were able to see themselves and see their history in a place that is, as their mission says, to get dedicated to the history of Holyoke. And so my hope is that we'll continue to build the archive through funding. We'll be able to continue to grow the stories, like oral histories. I want to do, I'm working on a oral history workshop for youth in the community so that they can do their own thing, because a point that I think is really relevant is that because of the history, because of the way that funding opportunities are set up, is largely that these fundings, and I think the reason why so many white folks are doing Black history is because the funding is attached to education, right? And so I got the opportunity to work on this project with these people that I love, who I found through this project are connected to me familially. And so I'm learning some of my family history through this project. But I think that I only had the opportunity to work on this, and I know that I only had the opportunity to work on this because I received funding, because I have a degree. And I think that when we're talking about doing local history, particularly talking about doing local history with local Black history, I think it's important to, as much as we can, in any ways that we can, to involve the community directly, and to create spaces and opportunities for not only for us to get the history and to produce these exhibits and produce these books and produce this work, but also, and get funding for that, right, for ourselves and for our institutions, but also to do that and create space and opportunity for people in the community to also learn what we know, be able to do this work, you know, for themselves and with themselves and amongst themselves, but also to get money to do that, right? Because like I said, a lot of the history came directly from people who had already been doing this work over generations. And again, I was only funded to do this, and I know this because, you know, on these applications, it asks for folks who have this degree. And so again, as much as we can, involve the community and also just create space. So my last thing that I'll say is I like to do this, Yolo Akili, I like their words. And so remember that oppression thrives off isolation. Connection is the only thing that can save you. Remember, oppression thrives on superficiality. Honesty about your struggles is the key to your liberation. Remember, your story can help save someone's life. Your silence contributes to someone else's struggle. Speak so we all can be free. Love so we can all be liberated. The moment is now. We need you.
Wow, Erica, that was phenomenal. And those closing words are so powerful. I know that we're all going to be holding on to that. And I appreciate especially your comments about who are the gatekeepers, and, you know, not just in terms of who's preserving this work and making it available or not, but the financial gatekeepers, the funders, all of that. And also about where knowledge sits, and reminding us that it sits in the community, and asking the public to help. So powerful. From all of you. So we have about 15 minutes for conversation now, and I have a few questions that have come in from the chat and the audience. So I think I'll just plunge into that, if that's all right with y'all. The first one is a comment, and I'd like to invite you all to respond to it. A thoughtful comment from someone who notes how important it is to, quote, be intentional about saying enslaved people rather than slaves, in order to not reduce people to a status that was imposed on them from without. And, you know, you've all touched on this in various ways, the difficult language that we're encountering in the historical record, and the need to be sensitive about language in the present. So I'd just like to invite all of you to comment on that, if you would.
So I couldn't agree more that in present day conversation, I think we need to use present day language. When we are talking about the past, I also think it's equally important to use exactly the words that were used in the document, even if they make us uncomfortable, because those words meant very different things in the past than they do now. In Little Compton, we actually were very fortunate to have a definition of the word Black written out in the town council records in 1763. Black meant anybody who was not white. So very different from what it means today. So a fully indigenous person could be listed as Black in the records in Little Compton in the 1760s. And so as people are doing their research, as people are writing things down, they want to be absolutely strict with themselves about writing it exactly as it appears, because if they make any kind of changes or any kind of assumptions, it's going to change the history and the meaning of what they're doing.
Erica, I saw you jumping in there too.
I think that language is really important. And I think that when we talk about enslaved people and calling them slaves, I think slaves as property, right? And I think that when we speak about enslaved humans, when we speak about enslaved Africans, when we speak about enslaved people, like really giving them their humanity, and also acknowledging the fact that it wasn't voluntary, right? Like I understand completely when we present documents and we present history and the way that we in the way that we should speak about that, right? But I think that when we talk about humans, that we should give them their humanity, and by acknowledging the fact that they didn't just, you know, hop on these boats and come over to do this work, that they were enslaved by someone. I think it also puts accountability on the people who, you know, stole these people and brought them involuntarily to this place. And you know, all the history that encompasses that. And so I think that it's really important to, yes, leave primary sources and documents the way that they are and present them in the way that they are, the way that they were. But I also think that when we use our language, that we should be careful and mindful about how we address folks, right? So yeah, that's what I got.
I know in my own work, the transition in use from slave owner to enslaver has been very valuable in shifting that, you know, to that responsibility that you mentioned. Another question that has come up, you know, all of you emphasized, you know, sort of this need to excavate these details and then connect them into these larger stories, which I really appreciate. One of the goals of this project is to help people do that across communities. And a question came up at the end of session 1 about, in addition to archival records, which has been our principal topic today, using material culture and objects to tell stories. And you've all had a hand in that in one way or another. So I just wonder if anyone can comment on reviewing collections for additional insight, thinking about the built environment, the landscape. Are there places we should be thinking and talking about beyond the archive?
Cemeteries, first and foremost, cemeteries. That I think is going to yield the graves of people of color. In our particular case, we also have several graves talking about white men who were sea captains who died off the coast of Africa. So that is a real clue that they were slave traders. And then we can follow that thread and try and learn more about them. So I think cemeteries are really important material culture, maybe the first place to go. But it pops up in very weird places. We were just donated a sampler from 1930, beautiful detailed sampler, all these beautiful little characters that represent Little Compton. And the family is stitched into the sampler at the bottom. And there's a Black woman with no explanation. But if you look at the censuses, you discover that this family had a Black housekeeper. So very weird little places, you can sometimes see Black faces and follow those leads.
Erica, Joe, Emma, anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
I think that, so one of the things that, and usually when I talk about Black Holyoke, one of the things that I bring up a lot is that there were Black landholders in Holyoke, right? I'm blanking on the name of the book, but it's the Green Book. And I can't remember if the author's name is Green or if the book is actually green. But that's my reference to it. It talks about when Holyoke is being industrialized, right? And it names these landholders, but it doesn't name their race, right? And so when I guess it kind of gets lost in the history of like who these people were, like who these Black folks who were landholders were. And one of the things that I think is really awesome and also very telling of like history and the way that history is done is that the land where Holyoke Community College is today, part of that land was Black owned, right? And I mean, this is like these aren't the folks who, you know, passed the land on or sold the land to Holyoke Community College, but I think that like we have to remember that folks lived in the community, right? And that often those homes that they lived in have either been demolished if they weren't recognized as historic. And I don't know, I just think that there's something to, when we can find the people beyond the churches, right, that are still standing, looking for the homes that are still standing, looking for the land, and in some way surveying the land, if we can, to really understand like not only who these people were, but where they lived and what it looked like, during these different periods of time, and what it looks like today, right? So that we can have an understanding of that connection, and the importance of place and space.
Right. One of the things that's a good point. One of the things that we talk about writing about this history or doing exhibits about the history, but I also find that not everyone turns to an exhibit or a book, but they live in their communities, and I think we need to see more sort of memorials about these individuals physically in the community. For example, if you go to the in West Springfield, the big white church on Elm Street or whatever, I know there's at least 36 African Americans who are buried there. There are no headstones that recognize that they are there. So, and there's other towns that list a list of the Revolutionary War veterans of that town, and that Black soldiers aren't listed in that. So there's opportunities to correct that and add those names. And again, if you look at the number of headstones of early African Americans, there's very few from the 18th century, usually the late 18th century, if that. And most of them, anything earlier, there's no stone. And it's not only that, but obviously white people who did not have the money to have a stone carved. That's why in a lot of the cemeteries, you don't find the common Revolutionary War white soldier there. You see the officers. You'll see all Lieutenant so and so, Major so and so, Colonel so and so. You don't see Private so and so. Very, very seldom. So there's a way that maybe some of these towns could recognize in those places some sort of plaque if we know who they were, or at least the fact, and then it documents the fact physically that there was a Black presence in our valley very early. Just a thought. Nice project for somebody.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joe. There's a follow-up question in the chat about whether much is known about burial practices for enslaved people here in the Valley. And I'm just gonna put in the chat a newish book that has come out called In Memory of Susan Freedom, Searching for Gravestones of African Americans in Western Mass by Bob Drinkwater, which might be of interest.
He did a good job with that. Yeah,
folks in the room. Well, we just have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to ask a quick question of Joe that has come in, which is in the first edition of your book on Hampden County, you closed the research at 1855, and then you extended it for the second edition. And could you just speak a little bit to the to your decisions about how late in time your study would go?
Well, what happened was when the first book came out, Gail King invited me to come down to Hartford to do a TV show about it. And when that happened, all of a sudden, for the next 10 years, I had African Americans all over the country who had a connection, sending me emails and letters. And, oh, by the way, and I said, oh, there's a lot more stuff that came out of their attics, basically, and out of their family Bibles, etc. And they were very enthusiastic. So I collected all of that and then spent the next umpteen years adding that, and then following up on little leads. And then the digital world happened, so I was able to really find even more material. And then I realized I started to find out how many Civil War, and I'm a Civil War historian too, how many men fought in the Civil War from our area. And I said, we got to include these guys. And then, of course, you have to include their families. And then you find all these other things, and you get involved with the whole era of slavery and then the anti-slavery movement, and how many local African Americans were very much involved with that. And I said, I have to get this. And so I then just took a 2-year lobbying campaign with New England Historic Gen and said, you need to put a new edition. And that's why the next edition is maybe more than twice as large as the first one. So that's how it happens.
Work is ongoing, right?
Yep.
Well,
in fact, I don't know if you can see, I have to show you, bringing that. So since you see this book? See all his notes? This is since the second edition. This is all the new information. So again, if people are using my book, if they should contact me on the email, I may have new information to add to what they're looking for.
If Joe, do you want to put your email in the chat? I think people would probably love to follow up on that. And
I will do it right.
Emma Winterzeig has also very kindly put her slides in the chat. And if others want to send us your slides or send us slides from them, we make those available too. Again, I'll mention that on the resources page for this project, there's just tons and tons of links to things, online readings, sites to readings, web exhibits, just everything we could find. And so we certainly invite anyone in our virtual space today to check that all out and to add or let us know what else should be added there. So we look forward to learning more from you. This brings us to 12:15. So I'm going to close this aspect of the program and thank our presenters for 4 really inspiring remarks that I think give us all the sense that the work is urgent, the work is hard, but it's possible, and that it's all part of building a community around the past and the present and the future. So I just want to pause for a minute for, virtual applause from the room. And at this point, I am going to hand the program over to my colleague at UMass Amherst, librarian Kate Friedman, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker. Thanks again, everyone, so far.
Thank you.
Take it over, Kate.